Broken Chain by Jacques Futrelle. In real life, a great criminal can never be caught red-handed for the simple reason that his crime is undetectable at the moment of its commission, Professor SFX Van Dusen remarked. He spoke with the tone of a man utterly unaccustomed to being contradicted. The underworld has its geniuses. Therefore, it is only logical that they be met by geniuses, men who reject mediocrity and amateurism. It is not uncommon for the police to find the truth beyond their reach. However, a truly distinguished criminal, a master professional, I do not hesitate to call him that, will consider a crime perfect only if it possesses no outward signs, a crime that no one, under any circumstances, can even recognize as such. J. Morgan Grayson, the financier, peered through clouds of cigar smoke at the thin, withered face of the man known to the world as the thinking machine. The psychology of the amateur. There is a strange psychological paradox, the professor continued. A crime often possesses an intense magnetic pull right up until it is committed, or, at best, for a few minutes afterward. For instance, a man who commits a murder out of revenge feels an urge to proclaim his deed to the whole world. Yet, within 10 minutes, fear inevitably takes hold. He begins to contradict himself, frantically trying to hide his tracks. Fear turns to panic. He loses his head and makes one blunder after another. He chooses the very path that a sophisticated mind can trace from its first impulse all the way to a prison cell. He paused, his pale eyes narrowing. Dealing with such men is child's play. But beyond them are the geniuses who have chosen crime as their vocation. We never hear them because they are never caught. We hardly even suspect them because they never make mistakes. Imagine what would happen if the greatest minds in history had turned their talents toward crime. Even now, gifted individuals are at work all around us. Murders are committed, thefts and robberies flourish, the likes of which we have never even dreamed. If I, for example, were to suddenly decide to become a criminal, he stopped abruptly. Grayson watched him, a strange expression on his face. I could kill you right here in this room, the professor resumed calmly, and no one would believe it, let alone accuse me. Why? Because I would not make a mistake. He spoke in a matter-of-fact, natural tone, one that suggested he was stating a plain truth rather than trying to shock his guest. Nevertheless, the effect on Grayson was profound. How would you do it? Grayson asked with a cautious curiosity. By any one of 1,000 ways. Poison, lethal microbes, a knife, or even a revolver, the scientist replied. I know how to use poisons and how to inoculate diseases. I know how to make a knife or a gunshot wound look like a perfectly staged suicide. I never make mistakes, Mr. Grayson. Science teaches us accuracy, not approximate accuracy, but absolute, indisputable precision. We must stand by our conclusions. After all, our work is not that of a carpenter. A carpenter can be imprecise and the house will not fall. But if a scientist allows such an error, it is equivalent to a break in a logical chain, and the entire structure collapses. Logic teaches us that 2 and 2 make 4, not occasionally, but invariably, under all circumstances. The problem of the leaked secrets. Grayson thoughtfully flicked the ash from his cigar. I was described to you as a man of extraordinary abilities, he said finally. Quentin Frazier, the banker who gave me a letter of introduction, told me how you once helped him solve a certain mystery. Yes, the professor interrupted impatiently. The midnight burglary at the Ralston Bank. I remember it. That is why I decided to seek your help in a matter even more mysterious than that. Grayson hesitated. I know it is useless to tempt you with a high fee, but perhaps the circumstances of the case itself will interest you. In that case, state them, the professor said. It can hardly be called a crime in a conventional sense, at least not one the law can prosecute, Grayson said hurriedly. But it has cost me several millions, and... Millions? The professor repeated. Yes, 6 or 8 million, perhaps 10, Grayson confirmed. It leads me to believe that something is very wrong in my office. My intentions become known to my competitors almost the moment I conceive them. My stake in the bank is in the millions. Strict secrecy is not a luxury, it is a necessity. For years I maintained it. But in the last 8 weeks, at least 6 times, my plans have reached my rivals, and I have suffered the losses. If you don't know the street, it is hard to imagine the danger when your every move is known in minute detail. I am not familiar with your world of finance, Mr. Grayson, the professor replied. Explain your meaning. Take the most recent case. The financier said seriously. To be brief, I decided to unload a block of P, Q, and X railway stock to my brokers to drive the price down. My plan was to then have other brokers buy it back at a pittance, giving me full control of the company. However, the moment I began to sell, my competitors intercepted the entire lot. Instead of gaining control, I lost my entire holding. This has happened 6 times now. I assume this was all fair play, the professor asked softly. Fair? Oh, yes, entirely legal. I am not so conceited as to think I understand the nuances of your business, the professor said politely. In the end, it doesn't matter. You wish to find the source of these leaks. Do I understand you correctly? Precisely. The search for the gap. Who is privy to your secrets? No one, except my stenographer, Miss Evelyn Wintron. She has been with me for 6 years, and I trust her implicitly. To whom do you speak of your intentions? To no one, the financier replied gloomily. I decided long ago that no one should know my plans. There is too much temptation. I never reveal my projects to anyone, except your stenographer, the professor clarified. I developed these plans for weeks, sometimes months, keeping every detail in my head. I never commit a word to paper, Grayson explained. When I say she is privy to them, I only mean she learns of them 30 minutes before the machine is set in motion. In the case of the P, Q, and X, my brokers had no idea of my real goal. Miss Wintron only knew 20 minutes before the exchange opened. I dictated a few short letters of instruction for my agents. That was all she could have known. Did you reveal your ultimate intentions in those letters? No. They contained only specific directions on what the brokers were to do. And yet, an experienced person, seeing those letters, could deduce your train of thought? Yes, but that is impossible. No single broker saw all the letters at once. Miss Wintron and I were the only people who knew the contents of all of them. The professor sank into a long silence, so deep that Grayson began to tap his fingers nervously. Who was in the room besides you and Miss Wintron before the letters were sent? The professor asked at last. No one, Grayson said firmly. From an hour before I began dictating until the moment my plans collapsed, no one else entered the room. And yet, after she finished the letters, did she leave for any reason? No, she didn't even get up from her desk. Did she take anything out of the room? Use carbon paper, perhaps? No. Did she make a phone call? No. The financier replied with conviction. Did she signal someone to the window? No. She finished typing and stayed at her desk. She hardly moved for 2 hours. Could someone have eavesdropped to the window? The building is 15 stories high, overlooks the street, and has no fire escape, Grayson said. If you knew the layout, you would see it's impossible because... Nothing is impossible, Mr. Grayson, the professor snapped. Incredible and impossible are 2 different things. Do not use that word. It irritates me. He paused. Did either of you answer the telephone? No one called, and we called no one. Are there any openings, cracks, or holes in the floor, walls, or ceiling? I have already hired private detectives. They searched everything and found nothing, Grayson said. He lit a new cigar and settled into his chair. Could the letters themselves have been intercepted? The blank letter. A few minutes later, the famous financier opened the door of his private office for the renowned scientist detective. The room's only occupant was a young woman, perhaps 26 or 28 years of age. She turned at the sound of the door, but seeing Grayson, she returned to her book. The financier moved toward an armchair. But instead of following suit, the The professor walked straight to Miss Wintron and held out the sealed envelope. "Mr. Ralph Matthews asked me to deliver this to you," he said. The young woman glanced up at him with a hint of timidity, took the envelope, and turned it over curiously in her hands. "Mr. Ralph Matthews?" she repeated, as if the name were entirely foreign to her. "I don't believe I know anyone by that name." The professor watched her face intently as she opened the envelope and withdrew the sheet of paper. Her expression registered nothing but surprise and confusion. "But this is only a blank sheet of paper," she said. The professor turned abruptly to Grayson, who had been watching the scene with open curiosity. "Your telephone, please," the professor requested. "Right here," Grayson replied. The professor leaned over the desk where Miss Wintron sat. She was still staring at him in genuine bewilderment, picked up the receiver, and held it to his ear. After a few seconds, he was speaking to the reporter, Hutchinson Hatch. "I only wanted to ask you to come to my place in an hour," the professor said. "It is very important." He hung up. For a few seconds, he gazed with apparent admiration at an elegant silver vanity case for powder and lipstick, which sat on Miss Wintron's desk behind the telephone. Then he took a chair behind Grayson and began a casual conversation about the weather. Grayson merely listened, while Miss Wintron returned to her book, The Rooftop Investigation. Later that night, Professor Augustus S. F.X., Van Dusen, and Hutchinson Hatch, the newspaper reporter, were examining the chimney stacks and other irregularities on the roof of the skyscraper. Far below them, the city streets stretched out in a vast panorama, a series of glowing dots beneath rooftops dimly visible in the night mist. Above the city lights, the impenetrable night hung like a veil, occasionally sparkling with the faint glimmers of stars. "There should be a wire around here somewhere," Hatch finally said, and they both leaned down. The professor felt around behind him, and for several minutes they moved in the darkness, their presence betrayed only by the dull glow of pocket flashlights. Finally, the professor drew himself up to his full height. "Here is the wire you were looking for, Mr. Hatch," he said. "I shall leave it to you." Hatch opened a small bag and took out several tools. He laid them out on the roof behind him, then, leaning over again, began his work. He labored in the dark for about half an hour, aided only by the beam of his small flashlight. Finally, he stood up. "Everything is ready," he said. The professor inspected the work and gave a satisfied grunt. Together, they headed for a skylight, leaving the wire behind and carefully noting their path. They descended into the dark hall of the top floor. From somewhere below came the faint echo of footsteps, the night watchman making his slow rounds through his deserted domain. "Be careful," the professor whispered. They crossed the hall to the rooms at the back of the building, still unspooling a wire behind them. They stopped before the last room. The professor fumbled in his pocket for a ring of keys and unlocked the door. Inside, the electric light was burning. The room was striking for its complete lack of furniture. The only evidence of human presence was a telephone mounted on the wall. The professor looked thoughtfully at the coil of wire, his thin face clouding with doubt. "It is careless," he said at last, "to leave the wire like this. True, this floor is unoccupied, but it is not impossible that someone might pass through and break it. Take the tools and return to the roof, winding the wire as you go. Then lower the coil to me from the roof, so I can pull it through the window. That will be better. I will catch it, and then nothing will betray our visit." Hatch exited quietly and closed the door behind him. The sound of the keys. Throughout the following day, the professor spoke with the financier twice by telephone. Grayson was in his office, and Miss Wintron was at her desk when the phone rang the first time. "Be careful how you answer my questions," the professor warned when Grayson picked up the receiver. "Do you happen to know how long Miss Wintron has had that elegant silver vanity case, the one on her desk next to the telephone?" Grayson instinctively glanced toward the stenographer, who was leisurely turning the pages of her book. "Yes," he replied. 7 months. I gave it to Miss Wintron myself last Christmas." "Aha!" the professor exclaimed. "That simplifies matters. Where did you buy it?" Grayson named a well-known jeweler. A short time later, The professor called again. What make of typewriter does Miss Wintron use? Grayson provided the brand name. Leaving Grayson to puzzle over these questions, the professor headed to the newspaper office to find Hatch. Do you type? He asked. Yes. On what brand? We have half a dozen different makes here in the office. They went into the editorial room, which was nearly empty at that hour. The professor's blue, slightly watery eyes settled on a typewriter with a specific crest on the front panel. There it is, he cried. Type something on it. He commanded Hatch. The professor sat behind Hatch. His eyes were turned away from the reporter, but his ears were only inches from the machine. He listened for about half a minute, then shook his head. Type only the vowels, he ordered. Slowly at first, then faster. Hutchinson obeyed. The professor shook his head again. They tested every machine in the office in this manner, after which the professor stood and walked out. His face wore an expression bordering on bewilderment. The logic of the night. That evening, the professor remained in his laboratory for several hours, reclining in a large armchair with his eyes fixed on the ceiling. Minute after minute ticked by, but he did not change his position or his gaze. A small wall clock in the foyer chimed 9, then 10, 11, 12, and finally 1. At about 1:30, the professor suddenly leaped up. I am turning into a positive blockhead, he cried. Of course. Of course. Why didn't I see it instantly? The next morning, Grayson did not go to his office at the usual time. Instead, he went straight to the professor's house, eager for an explanation of the note that had been delivered to his home. Nothing is entirely clear yet, the professor said as the financier entered. But today, you must do exactly as I tell you. At 1 o'clock, he continued, you are to give instructions for the start of a major new operation. There must be no deviation from your usual routine. Dictate the letters to Miss Wintron, but under no circumstances are you to send them. When she brings them to you, keep them in your possession until you see me. The decoy operation. You insist that the operation be a complete fiction? The financier asked. Exactly, the professor replied. Do not forget to make the instructions look plausible. Do not miss a single detail that will make them absolutely logical and convincing. Once Grayson had departed for his office, the professor called Hatch on the telephone. I have solved the puzzle, he announced curtly. For today, I need the best telegraph operator you know. Bring him with you and meet me in the telephone room on the top floor at 1:45. A telegraphist? Hatch repeated. I said a telegraphist. The professor snapped. I shall see you then. Hatch smiled at the other end of the line as he heard the professor hang up. He had come to know the eccentric manners of this unique individual, whose mind could dismantle any problem set before it. He went to the telegraph department and secured the services of the head operator. At exactly 12:45, they were in the small room on the top floor. The operator's face was a mask of bewilderment. The room was entirely empty of furniture. The telephone box on the wall was the only object in sight. I will explain everything when the time comes, the professor said, noting the man's confusion. At 1:03, he handed the operator a blank sheet of paper and gave his final instructions. From the operator's expression, it was clear he felt like the victim of a ridiculous practical joke. Nonetheless, he obeyed. The professor stood by, checking the watch in his hand with mounting impatience. Hatch had no idea what was about to happen, but he was intensely intrigued. Finally, the operator heard something. His face instantly became alert. He listened for a few seconds, and then a smile of recognition spread across his face. The silver vanity case. Less than 10 minutes after Miss Wintron had handed Grayson the typed letters for his signature, and while Grayson was still in his private office, turning them over in his hands with a puzzled look, the door opened and the professor entered. He tossed a folded sheet of paper onto the desk in front of Grayson and walked straight toward Miss Wintron. Do you still intend to claim that you are not acquainted with Mr. Ralph Matthews? He asked. The girl stood up, her face a mask of well-rehearsed indignation. What do you mean, sir? She asked sharply. You may put away the silver vanity case now. the professor continued ruthlessly. "You will no longer need to maintain the connection." Miss Wintrin darted a quick glance at the telephone, her hand instinctively reaching toward it. The silver vanity case lay directly beneath the receiver, acting as a prop. It held the receiver just high enough so that the weight was lifted off the hook. Keeping the line open, she snatched the box away, and the receiver clicked back down. The professor turned to Grayson. "It was Miss Wintrin," he said. "Miss Wintrin." Grayson exclaimed, "I find that very difficult to believe." "Read this transcript I have given you," the professor said coldly. "Perhaps it will help you change your mind." The financier unfolded the paper and read aloud, drawing out the words, "Peabody, sell 10,000 L and V at 97. McCracken Company, sell 10,000 shares of L and V at 96. His astonishment grew as he read. Then, as the significance of the words sank in, his lips tightened. "I see, Miss Wintrin," he said at last. "These are the exact instructions I dictated, and you somehow made them known to persons for whom they were never intended. I do not know how you did it, but I know now that you are to blame. Therefore," he walked to the door and opened it with menacing politeness, "you may go." Miss Wintrin offered no defense. She merely bowed and walked out. Grayson watched her leave, then turned to the professor and gestured toward a chair. "How does she do it?" he asked. "The rhythm of the keys." "Miss Wintrin is an extraordinarily clever woman," the professor replied. "So clever that she forgot to inform you that, in addition to shorthand and typing, she is also a skilled telegrapher. She was so proficient that she could combine the two skills. In other words, while typing your letters, she managed to give the keys a rhythm based on the Morse telegraphic code. A telegraphist at the other end of the line could hear the clatter of her typewriter and translate the keystrokes into words." Grayson stared at him, incredulous. "I still don't understand," he said. The professor walked over to Miss Wintrin's desk. "Observe the telephone. The silver vanity case you gave her for Christmas happened to be just tall enough to prop the receiver up. When she did this, the line became active. From your desk, you couldn't see the phone. It was a simple matter for her to lift the receiver and slide the box under it, keeping the line open. This allowed the sound of the typing to travel to whoever was waiting at the other end. By the frequency of the strokes and the pauses between them, an outside operator could read your letters the very moment they were being typed. It was simply a matter of Miss Wintrin being careful not to break her rhythm. But that is a crime." Grayson cried. She must answer for it. "I would not advise you to prosecute Miss Wintrin," the professor said. "If one juggles stocks in the manner you described to me, fairly, as you put it, then her actions were no more dishonest than yours. Besides, she would certainly be supported by the very men who made a fortune off of you. I wouldn't start a mess with a lawsuit. She betrayed your trust, certainly, but—" He stood up as if he had said all there was to say. "However, I would suggest you fire whoever is working your switchboard." "She was involved, too?" Grayson asked. He rushed out of his office and nearly collided with clerk. "Where is Miss Mitchell?" he demanded. "I was just coming to tell you, sir," the clerk replied. "She and Miss Wintrin just left the building together, without a word of explanation." "Good day, Mr. Grayson," said the professor. The financier could only nod his head in silent gratitude. A final act of logic. Some time later, Professor Van Dusen received a check for $10,000 signed by J. Morgan Grayson. He looked at the check for a few moments. Then, in his cramped, illegible handwriting, he wrote an endorsement on the back. "Pay to the order of the home for crippled children." He then called for Martha to take it to the post.